Ever wonder what focal length to use for your portraiture? On my table here is actually 3 different lenses, or actually 4. This is actually the R5 with the 50mm, but most importantly, we are talking about these 3 lenses here: Sigma 40mm, RF 85mm, and the Canon EF 200mm. So I recently did a shoot, and I just want to talk about this subject on what focal length to use for the purpose of portraiture. But before we even talk about what focal length to use, we need to understand a little bit on perspective distortion. How does focal length affects bokeh, and of course the effects of compression. And in this tutorial series, we will talk about all this here. So I'm Richard, and welcome to ZP Productions, and today we'll be on a subject called focal length, and how does it actually affect, and ultimately why people choose certain focal lengths for the purpose of portraiture. So let's take a look at this PowerPoint slide, I literally want to say. So this is actually a tutorial, so let's go on and talk about it. So focal length really affects, your perspective distortion, bokeh, and compression. So actually, what is exactly perspective distortion, right? So imagine that you are using a wide angle lens and there is this subject here. So you want to take this particular scene, and the subject you want of this certain size in the scene. So you can just imagine that you draw an angle out and then the subject is there. Now this is a wide angle lens, and what happens if you use a telephoto lens will be something like this. Now you want the subject to be the same size in the frame, the image scene, and then the telephoto lens will be used. And if you look at this picture now together, both the subjects are about the same size, but notice there is something different, and that's where perspective distortion steps in. Because if you look at a wide angle lens, the closest point and the furthest point, they are very big difference. The closest point is probably, if you look in this particular diagram, the closest point for a wide angle lens may be, let's say, around half the length of the furthest point. It's just half the length of the furthest point. Well, if you actually look at the telephoto lens itself, the closest point and the furthest point difference is very small, maybe a 90% and maybe a 10% difference, where the 90% is the closest point and 100% is the furthest point, in terms of distance wise. And this results in perspective distortion because subject closer to you always look bigger. That is the very basis. And if you notice, the difference is very big for a wide angle lens, while the difference of a telephoto lens is very small. And this brings about why people say that if you use a wide angle lens, your nose tend to be bigger, your face tend to be a bit wider, and I guess more distorted. While if you use a telephoto lens, everything gets a bit compressed because the difference between all the different points on the face is a lot smaller, so everything looks correct. Now, the thing is that our human eye is about 40 to 50 mm, depends on how you see. So our eyes actually have a certain amount of perspective distortion. That's the reason why people say that if you use a 50 mm lens, it looks very natural, while if you use a longer lens, it looks flattering because the things are actually at the correct point. It's like looking at somebody really far away and everything looks very proportionate. While if you go very close with a wide angle lens, you get perspective distortion where the nose is bigger than the maybe the eyes, and it looks really, really weird. And to illustrate this, you can see these two pictures here. One is shot with the Sigma 40mm and one is shot with the Canon 200mm. And you'll notice straight away this difference where the nose on the wide angle lens is bigger than the nose on the telephoto lens, which is it feels a lot more flattering overall. But there's also something to talk about, and what focal length we use also depends on how much bokeh we want and the subject background and stuff. So this is where I added in the background for this particular section now, and we talk about bokeh in nature. Now, if you notice, one thing in this particular image is that the Sigma 40mm, for example, or should I say the wide angle lens, will capture more items in the background compared to the telephoto. As you can see, the angles I draw out and the background objects. So background objects in telephoto lens tend to be bigger in nature and lesser in nature also. So they tend to look less messy just from the basis of having less subject in the background. And you can actually choose how you want to frame better that way. Now, we talk a little bit about bokeh first. Now, bokeh is actually the background blur, and the background blur is actually affected by a few things: the aperture, the focal length, where the longer the better, and the distance between you and the subject and the background. Really, this is all the things that affect the amount of blur. where you can imagine that you apply a 4-pixel blur or 5-pixel blur or Gaussian blur across the subject, and that is what we are talking about, the amount of blur. Now, focal length in a very simple mathematical way is that about 40, I remember it's about 40 to 50% increment in focal length equal to one aperture difference in bokeh. Or should I say the amount of blur, not the bokeh, the amount of blur. So you can think of it as how do I put it? 85mm versus 120mm. If they were 120mm had like f2 and the 85mm has f1.4, the amount of blur is the same or approximately the same. But because the 120mm will capture less subject, or should I say less item in the background, they tend to have a smoother bokeh because of the less item, less clutter, as you can see in the previous picture. Now, taking all of that in mind, right, then you'll move on to the next one, because having a 200mm, for example, will really allow you to control what goes in the background, and because of the blur, things look a lot smoother. While for a wide angle lens, even if you have a f1.0, it's because there's so many things in the background, and of course, as I say, a 50% increment in focal length will result in a lot more blur. A 24mm will never equate to a 200mm unless it's like 200mm f5.6 and the 24mm is like f1 or something like this. Then you can get almost similar amount of blur. But by the nature of having a wide angle lens, you have more items on the background and it just looks messy. So now really, if you want to look at it from the imagery aspect, this is what happens. A 40mm will capture a lot of items in the background. Yes, the bokeh is still strong because it's f1.4, but it will never look better than 85mm at 1.4 or 1.2, and a 200mm will just allow you to really compress and control your subject. Also, you notice that the amount of distortion is a bit different. The nose on the Sigma 40mm is bigger than the RF 200mm. You can really tell even in such a small shot. And this is why also I love telephotos, because telephotos tend to make your subject look less distorted. And even if you shoot from very low angle, in this case my camera is about the height of the knee, you can see that the 40mm is a bit distorted. The feet especially, notice the shoe is a bit bigger, and overall the legs are a bit distorted. They look bigger than the body. While at the 200mm, they look just about proportionate. So the advantage of using a telephoto lens is really simple. The longer the lens, the more upright the person look like, the less distorted the person look like, and therefore a lot of photographers that do portraiture prefers longer lens. But that being said, the shorter lens like the Sigma 40mm give you perspective distortion, and that may be what you want, especially if you want a very dynamic photo or you want a true to life photo, because our eyes are about 40 to 50mm, and if you look at certain angles and you want a more dramatic shot, a more energetic and dynamic shot, the wide angle lens may be the way to go. If you notice, the 85mm actually is in between. It's in between the wider lenses, the true to life lenses, and also the super teles, which give you very low perspective distortion. The 85mm sits right in between, give you nice amount of low perspective distortion. Very nice bokeh, because normally they come in very fast f1.4, f1.2 aperture, and they do compress the scene to a certain extent that some people will really like. And if you really think about it, 85mm is very manageable. You stand maybe like 5 meters away or 8 meters away, you get a full body shot. While 200mm, you really need to stand 10 over meters away to do the full body shot. Not only that, if you look at the size of the lens, 85mm lens isn't much bigger than a very good 35mm or 40mm lens, but a 200mm lens at f2 is massive in nature. Or even the 200mm, the 7200 f2 points are really quite big. All this adds up to why the 85mm is probably the most popular portrait lens. But then again, remember what I said earlier, if you want something more dynamic, you want something more true to life, or you want something really a bit different from normal, the wider lenses as portrait lens can actually give you the effect. Of course, try not to close up and give distortion on the face, because that looks bad. And if you want something pop, something more fashion, something that really focuses on the subject, get your telephotos, because they don't have distortions, they always make the model look upright, and they really emphasize on the subject itself more than any other lenses here. So in the end of the day, which lens to get depends on what you want to do for your portraits. Now, this is a tutorial that I always wanted to do, because a lot of people ask me what focal length to choose or what focal length I use. Really, it depends on the I would say as the flavor of the shoot that I'm doing. I can bring any of these lenses out, and it really depends on the flavor. If I want to do cosplay, normally I take something like 40mm because I want more dynamic shot. But if I'm going to the beach, I normally take 85mm or even 200mm because I just want to emphasize on the subject itself. That is really how I do my shots. I hope you enjoy this short little tutorial, and I really hope that you learn something of why you choose different focal length because of all the various things that happen based on the focal length themselves. And in the end of the day, what you choose is up to you. Till next time, I will see you again. Bye bye.